bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the January 6th, 2026 episode. Welcome to the new year. I look forward to bringing you engaging podcasts that help demystify tax credit financing over the course of the year and spur more renewable energy, community development, affordable housing, and historic preservation across America. Now, of note, as we start the year 2026, this is the 900th episode of the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast. Quite the accomplishment, and you might be wondering, when did Tax Credit Tuesday premiere? Well, our first episode was October 25th, 2007, so quite a few years ago. My guest this week, that those who are watching on YouTube can see, is Rich Larsen. Rich is a partner in Novogradac's Toms River, New Jersey office, and he's the practice leader for public housing here at Novogradac. Rich is a frequent guest on the podcast, and I did ask him to join me to kick off 2026 so we could do a deeper dive into the topic of my January Washington Wire column in the Novogradac Journal of Tax Credits. Now, the column is entitled, Facing Mounting Capital Needs, More Housing Authorities Should Turn to RAD. Now, in the column, I discussed the many reasons why public housing authorities that own public housing units should be giving serious consideration, if they haven't already, to participating in the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, commonly known as RAD. And even those agencies that in the past have chosen not to participate in RAD should reconsider that prior decision. Now, the RAD program was introduced in 2012 as a way for public housing authorities to leverage government funding to raise private equity to renovate public housing. And in the course of the podcast, Rich and I are going to discuss what the RAD program is and how it allows public housing authorities to leverage government funding and how that creates the capital to renovate public housing. Rich also will discuss some of the reasons why we're at a point where many more public housing authorities are going to choose to go down the RAD program route. Now, Rich and I have a lot to discuss, so I'm not going to say more on the introductory point. I'm just going to jump right into this. So if you're ready, let's get right into the podcast, episode number 900. So, Rich, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me back, especially with the 900th episode. I do feel honored.
Yeah, I suspect I'll get a few emails from our partners saying, Mike, why couldn't I be on the 900th episode? I want 1,000 now. But that'll be a couple years away. So this is your 11th appearance on Tax Credit Tuesday, so thank you for being a frequent guest. And I think that number surprised you when we were preparing for the episode. You were thinking, it can't really be 11, can it? And of course it is. And I will note for those who didn't see the most recent episode, on January 28, 2025, you were on, and it was the most streamed episode in Tax Credit Tuesday history. So you are a very popular guest. If I was going for ratings, I'd have you back even more often than 11. So maybe I'll have to start to do that.
Yeah.
And some of
it
them
was more the topic.
Yes.
More the topic that, yes, but that's okay. I'll take the credit though, if you want to.
It definitely was the topic, but I couldn't do the topic alone. So it was you being here to discuss that topic. And for those that don't know what that topic was, at January 28, 2025, you can probably guess. It was where we looked at what a second Trump administration might mean for housing authorities, for Section 8 contracts, for the Department of Housing and Urban Development more generally. Everyone was very curious about that, trying to plan ahead. And this episode feels to a certain degree like a spiritual successor to that episode we began. It wasn't the first episode of last year, but it was an early episode of last year. And now here we are a year later, and we can discuss what has happened, what the future might hold for public housing authorities, particularly with respect to their public housing units. But I'm anxious to dive into all of this. Before I do that, I always like to give my guests an opportunity to introduce themselves to our audience for those that aren't familiar with you. So please take a moment to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Mike. And once again, my name is Rich Larsen. I am a partner in Novogradac's Toms River, New Jersey office. Primarily, I am an auditor of public housing authorities. We audit probably about 85 housing authorities across the country. And then with that, we also provide audit services to the tax credit affiliates of housing authorities, their nonprofit affiliates, provide tax preparation services. And also we consult on the various PHA programs, including what we're talking about today, the Rental Assistance Demonstration or RAD program.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Now, I'd like you to give a brief overview of what the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program is. I explained in the introduction how it's an opportunity for housing authorities to be able to leverage their federal funding to generate equity from the private market. But please discuss some of the mechanics as to how the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program works. And it's been a demonstration program for quite a few years now.
Right. Yeah, about 13 years or so. It's been
Yep.
a demonstration program, but it is a mature program. And simply put, the RAD program, it's a voluntary program of the United States Department of Housing or Development, and it really seeks to preserve public housing by providing those housing authorities with more stable funding in order to make improvements to their public housing properties. The goal of RAD really is to, number one, stabilize funding for PHAs. PHAs are part of that unstable and inconsistent, Section 9 funding.
Yep.
And they're going to move to a more stable, familiar Section 8 platform. PHAs are going to create access to private capital. They're going to be able to borrow through bank loans, through state financing agencies. They're going to be able to utilize tax credit equity. A goal of RAD is also to streamline HUD programs, become more efficient. Housing authorities can go from operating 3 programs, a public housing, a capital fund program, and a voucher program, to one program, to just operating that Section 8 voucher program. So you consolidate, streamline, but best of all, I think it really enhances options for residents. Residents move from an older, outdated public housing property to a newer, more modern unit.
No, I appreciate you pointing that out at the end there, because sometimes on these podcasts, we deal with all the mechanics, the financing and all that, and not paying as much attention to directly pointing out that this is all about housing for residents, affordable housing for residents. So that's what the RAD program is designed to provide. For those that are not that familiar with the RAD program, please share some key KPIs, some key performance indicators of RAD so that the audience has a sense of the magnitude of the number of units that have went through or in the pipeline of going through this RAD process and how much in capital it's actually raised, because it's quite astounding.
Sure. We are accountants, but there's probably not a lot of accountants out there, so I don't give too many numbers. But the good thing is RAD has been a successful redeveloper of public housing units for the last 13 years. PHAs have converted 200,000 public housing units to the Section 8 platform, and there is another 200,000 in the pipeline in various stages through development. There's been over $25 billion of construction investment, direct hard cost investment in those units. And that's a pretty good record. But there's still 900,000 public housing units in HUD's inventory. I got to say, RAD got off to a great start. The pandemic hit. And then since then, it slowed down quite a bit up until about a year ago. And now we're seeing a lot of renewed interest in the program over the past year. And that may be because a lot of the current events, what's happened in the economy and politics and so forth. And hopefully we'll get into that in a little bit.
Thank you for that. One of the reasons why I did write the article for the Washington Wire in January, and thank you for your assistance with that, is because of all the outreach we've been getting from public housing authorities and those who work with public housing authorities about the benefits and the inner workings of the RAD program. And it's not a coincidence that we're starting to hear a lot more getting a lot more outreach from public housing authorities. It's, of course, because the funding challenges for public housing authorities are generally getting worse, certainly not getting better. And in many ways, the funding challenges are getting worse. And you mentioned how RAD can create an opportunity of more stable funding and the like. But let's first start with, from your perspective and from the perspective of a housing authority, how is it that HUD funding is not meeting the needs of housing authorities, as well as directionally not getting any better, and for many on an arc, at least in the near term, to be worse?
Right. Sure, Mike. Great question. So there's two parts to public housing funding. There's the capital funding for the major improvements of the units, and then there's operating funding for the day-to-day maintenance of those units. So capital fund wise, housing authorities are receiving on average between $1,000 to $1,500 per unit per year in capital funding, which doesn't come close to meeting their needs. CLAFA, which is the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities, estimates the capital need on a per unit basis in 2025 to be $175,000 per unit. And that's up considerably from the 2010 estimate, which is about $60,000 per unit. So getting up to $1,500 per unit is nowhere near making a dent in the capital need in these units. And in fact, they're actually going backwards at a pretty good rate. That the $1,500 doesn't even meet the current need. Operationally, the fiscal year 2026 budget is estimated to come in at about 90% of what housing authorities need to operate efficiently. So what happens is housing authorities will fill out a subsidy request, and it comes up with a per unit month amount that they need to operate their housing authority at a break even. And housing authority officials are expecting about 90% of that amount for 2026. So that's a challenge. And then there's been added administrative burden. HUD has generated a few administrative notices, I think, that'll really drain public housing authority resources in fiscal year 2026, just really added to their administrative burden. And they just don't have the people to do a lot of this work, this extra work. So there's quite a bit of challenges in fiscal year 2026. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of housing authorities say, all right, it's time to do something. We have to convert, we have to utilize the RAD program, or at least find out more about it.
So Rich, when you were preparing for the podcast, you explained to me, and I'll probably misstate this, so please correct me to the extent that I'm misstating it, that the housing authority will have a budget on a given asset, how much an operating cost subsidy they're entitled to from HUD, but they're changing the way in which that calculation is done, which means that in the past, the full amount of the subsidy might be able to be drawn down from HUD, but the way the calculation is going to be done in the future, some portion of that subsidy might not be able to be fully drawn down, which basically means the housing authority this year might be leaving more money on the table than they have in prior years because of this administrative change. Do I have that right?
That's very good, Mike. That's very good. Yeah. So to be a little more specific, back in July 2025, HUD issued a PIH notice, the Public and Indian Housing Notice, number 2520, which virtually eliminated the PHA's ability to earn a profit for the most part. Through 2025, and for the 25 years that I've been auditing public housing authorities, PHAs received their full allotment of subsidy. They got 1/12 of that every month. And if they generated generous amount of program income, say, between their rental income and maybe they have a cell phone tower on their roof, and maybe they were generated good laundry room income, they rented out their community center, that project could have generated a nice profit, a nice reserve. Well, now it's going to be a lot more difficult because the housing authorities are going to be required to use those funds first, and then only be able to use their subsidy when they have expenses to utilize that subsidy. So therefore, if there's no expenses, you can't draw down on the subsidy, which makes generating reserves impossible. So If you're a housing authority, you have this one project that's been doing great and you've been supporting other projects that haven't been doing so great, you're going to run out of funds and you're not going to be able to do that. So housing authorities are going to go in this downward spiral. How fast depends on how much reserves they have, but it definitely is a downward spiral trajectory. And so I think that this notice that has come out in July really hit housing authorities hard, saying, well, obviously we have to get out of the public housing program. It's not sustainable.
And that's also when we were preparing for the podcast, you were noting that even those housing authorities in the past have looked at RAD and thought RAD wasn't something worked for them, might need to be revisiting that with this new notice. And of course, you don't know what the durability of the notice is. There's no reason to believe it's not durable for the next few years.
Right, exactly.
So now let's look at the RAD program. We've talked about the fact that the operating cost subsidy may not be fully drawn down. We've talked about how the capital improvement subsidy isn't nearly sufficient to deal with all the deferred capital needs. And the RAD program is an opportunity for a public housing authority to take those operating costs and capital improvement subsidy streams and in essence convert it to a predictable stream of rental income over the future. And that stream of rental income, you can then look at that, back out the projected operating expenses, generate a net operating income, and that net operating income can be leveraged with hard debt. So they can use that stream as a way to raise debt on a project by project basis. And in addition to raising that debt, there could be other grants and subsidies available to create the capital needed to renovate the public housing. Now, there's a lot embedded in what I just said. And I know that a large number of these transactions are done. One of the other subsidies brought in is long-term tax credits, but not all. So let's start with, you can give some examples of how that works for a transaction that's not using tax credits. And then we can come back to layering in tax credits.
Yeah, that's right, Mike. RAD is not exclusive to tax credits. You can utilize conventional debt or soft debt. You can use a housing authority's own funds to convert to RAD. It all really depends on the capital need of the housing authority and what they can afford. So we had a client recently, they owned a senior building. It had a modest capital need. PHA went to the local bank, borrowed money, and now they're able to secure that mortgage with the property. They were never able to do that in the public housing program. So now the bank is very happy. They have a secured interest in that property. PHA went out, borrowed funds at a great rate to cover their capital requirements, which is required to convert through RAD. They continue to own the building. They did all the improvements. They had tremendous savings in their utility costs, in their maintenance costs, because it's now a modern unit with modern appliances and so forth. The operating capital fund subsidy converted to the stable Section 8 platform. And now they're receiving, with the Section 8 platform, a steady OCAF, which is an operating cost adjustment factor, an annual increase in the cost of living. They don't have to worry about proration we just talked about in the public housing program because they're no longer in it. They're no longer subject to those public housing rules and regulations. And the best thing, there's no restriction on the profit that they generate from operating these units now. It's non-federal money. HUD can go back and attach to that money. And board members can utilize those funds for their mission. They want to build a playground. They want to reinvest in other affordable housing. They want to do a community center. That's all perfectly legitimate uses of those funds.
Thank you for that. And what you said is, it's fairly straightforward, but obviously there's lots of details in all of this. And this is definitely one of those areas where you don't want to try it at home alone. I definitely encourage the audience to reach out to Rich or me or someone else at Novogradac to help begin these sort of discussions, because obviously there's a lot of financial analysis you have to do to show what the net benefit is over the long term for your housing residents. Now, in all of that, we could do a whole podcast on some of the various financing options. It's somewhat straightforward to say, here's what my current public housing subsidy is. I want to flip it into a project-based Section 8 contract. So I have predictable rental streams. I can run the numbers on net operating income, calculate how much hard debt the project could support, as well as look at other HUD guaranteed loans, other soft financing, other housing authority equity, a variety of other sort of sources to try to help fill the gap to make the renovation. And if you end up through all of that, because you're selling the public housing to this property partnership, there could be a portion of that selling price paid not in a note, but paid in cash that frees up more cash for the housing authority to provide affordable housing for more residents of the community. So maybe we can do a whole podcast on that in the future. So get to a dozen, and then we'll work on a baker's dozen. Yeah. But what I'd like to move to now is what is a quite popular approach to generating subsidy. And of course, Tax Credit Tuesday, what might that be? It's the long housing tax credit. And one of the catalysts for us getting so many more calls from housing authorities and those who work with housing authorities is the fact that there are these financing challenges that are expanding, but also because of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the ability for a housing authority to access long housing tax credits went dramatically. Way in the back, we have podcasts on this in the past. There was a concern that the huge capital needs that public housing authorities have, that they would basically go around all the state tax credit agencies, allocating agencies, some are states, and basically absorb or vacuum up all the long housing tax credits. And then obviously the states have a variety of needs. They have to provide affordable housing to a variety of constituencies and not just be used as a means of dealing with deferred capital needs of housing authorities. But now with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the 50% financed by test is now 25%, starting January 1, 2026. By virtue of each project needing less bonds to be entitled to loans and tax credits, it means states and local allocating agencies can allocate to 100% more developments, all things being equal. And by virtue of being able to support 100% more developments on the bond side, housing authorities should find that they're looking at a RAD transaction, there's greater availability for this bond financing. So those in the past that weren't interested in RAD might be saying to themselves, because of these financing changes, we should be interested. Those that weren't interested because they couldn't get tax credits should be saying, well, maybe I can get tax credits now. There's a lot of catalysts behind this. So with that being said, that's not much of a question. I'm testifying to myself. But if you could discuss how the tax credit equity is used in a RAD transaction.
Sure, Mike. And you're right. Over half of the RAD transactions to date have utilized low-income housing tax credits. The low-income housing tax credit, I think, works best when the PHAs have moderate to major capital needs because they just can't finance that on their own. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics and the basics of that transaction. So technically, the PHA will sell that public housing property, those units, that project, to a partnership or to an LLC. I know that scares some board members and some local officials at first, but that is the vehicle necessary to deliver tax credits to the investor. But you have to remember the PHA maintains control of that property through a variety of ways, through a land lease or even through the general partner of that partnership or the managing member of the LLC. So you still have the same control as you did when the authority owned that property. There's no difference. And you can give up some, if you like, some management functions, some development functions, and that's the housing authority's choice. 100%, that's the board's choice. So once that property is put into the tax credit vehicle, whether it be the LLC or the GP, that tax credit entity is going to receive the tax credit equity. It's going to receive debt to finance the capital needs of that project. Now, the operating and the capital subsidy that comes through the public housing authority is going to get transferred over to that entity in the form of Section 8. Now, in Section 8, as Mike mentioned before, is a much more stable platform with annual adjustments, cost of living adjustments, and it's something that developers and investors and bankers are familiar with. So it's much easier to leverage those dollars and borrow against And I think the one big beautiful bill really does present some opportunities because we've been getting calls. I don't know, Mike, if you mentioned the 12% boost to the 9% credits as well, because we do have some fair cloth to RAD conversions. So housing authorities have this availability to create new properties to new public housing units through the fair cloth provision, and the 9% credit is ideal for that. And so we've been getting some calls on that. And I think that's going to be a boost to the fair cloth provisions in the RAD legislation. We estimate, Mike, at Novogradac, that the one big beautiful bill, I think 1.2 million more affordable rental homes across the United States could be financed with the low-income housing tax credit. I think public housing authorities are in a great position to really take advantage of it. I think given the state of the public housing program, you really have to try to make this work now. If you're on the fence, you got to give it your all to get out of the public housing program.
I will note on that 1.2 million affordable rental homes that assumes the various allocated agencies of bond issuance authority for that is going to residential housing now is maintained, and that states lower their finance by test from whatever they're using now to half of that. And also that they open up the program and the allocations to ACT rehabs and the like. So there's a number of items there, but I think the public housing authorities across this country ought to be getting in line and working with their allocated agencies and discussing the importance of allowing them to compete for those bonds in an acquisition rehab category. And I say that because, as frequent listeners know, many states have been prioritizing new construction, and new construction with private activity bonds generally requires a lot of additional subsidy, or at least some additional subsidy, and that won't scale with this doubling. But there's also been this deferred ability, or the inability of property owners of existing properties that are interested in renovation to reserve the affordable housing to be able to access the funding. And this creates that opportunity to access that funding. And you did also mention fair cloth to Roth. We had a prior podcast, as you know, on that. So we'll link to the fair cloth to RAD podcast for those of you that are not familiar with what that concept means. But the reason why the 9% is more attractive is the 9% credit generates a lot more funding to cover some of the costs associated with the fair cloth to RAD. I'll also note that if you're just thinking of numbers in your head for the audience, the tax credit equity that's being generated, you can generate enough tax credit equity to cover 30 to 40% of the renovation costs of that public housing, as well as 30 to 40% of the cost of the building that this partnership is buying from the housing authority. So the combination of the 30 to 40% of equity of the renovation cost plus the 30 to 40% of the acquisition cost building, along with debt that you could be leveraging from the Section 8 contract, that creates a more predictable net operating income, as well as other financing sources, is the core of one of these transactions. And feel free to elaborate on that, please, Rich, to help fill in some blanks.
A lot of housing authorities in the past have said, yeah, I know the 30 to 40% we can get with equity. We can borrow another 30%, but that's it. And it's not penciling out for us because we still have a hole. And so that's what's kept them from converting to RAD. They say, oh, it's just not penciling out for us. In that instance, I've seen some housing authorities have success. And recently we were involved in doing a little dog and pony show for one of the local governments that the housing authority resided in, saying, this is what's going on with the public housing program. We can't afford to keep it operating. It's going to really impact the quality of life of your constituents. Right. We need some soft debt. We need some help converting to RAD. And then this is our projection. This is the reserves we're going to generate, the money we're going to save, and we're going to be able to reinvest. Down the line, we think we can pay you back. But the important thing is selling that to the local government, because if you can't, I mentioned that downward spiral in the public housing program with that new PIH notice, and that's just one. There's a couple more out there that just makes it really tough on housing authorities that operate a public housing program, even very efficiently, to survive and to make money and to provide that quality of life, quality of service to their residents. And I think you really have to sell that to your local government, to the state government, to the county government, to try to fill that gap and convert to RAD.
And I would also just layer in there that I'm throwing around these percentages, you're throwing around these percentages. As there's so much more detail and nuance to the various calculations and different financing structures and techniques and the like to help fill the gap. And I would think, get your quick take on this, that every public housing authority that hasn't thought about RAD and or has thought about RAD but chose not to go forward with RAD, that they should be looking at their portfolio and identifying and doing a quick analysis as to the benefits of a RAD conversion for each of the different assets. And it's hard for me to believe that there aren't going to be some assets, and if not all, that you look at and say, boy, that really works with this. And if all it is to get one in the pipeline to learn about and to work through and to deal with all the various sorts of issues and then replicate it, that seems like something that every housing authority should be doing. What's your quick take?
Absolutely. I agree with you. And I think the most important thing is to have experienced people on your side, not just the experience from Novogradac, but also the experienced attorney to write these land leases, to write the deals, the partnership agreements, the consultant to get you the highest rent possible. Novogradac, we work with consultants from all over the country to put together the best deal for our housing authority clients, because you're in charge. The housing authority, this is your property. You can make the deal. You can make the deal with anybody you want to, and you want to get the best deal and really capitalize on the property that you have, on that asset that you do have. And if you want to develop it, if you have the expertise to develop it and earn the developer fee, that's great. If you want to continue managing the property and earn that non-federal management fees each month, which a lot of our clients do, or you might say, you know what? No, we want to just be more of a holding company and just collect asset management fees, and we'll do some file certifications. That's fine. We have the whole gamut of transactions here.
The other thing I would also say is I know that you get calls, I get calls from housing authorities that are saying, can you introduce me to other housing authorities that have done this, that are interested, and will talk to me, or can I do a site visit and fly out and see how they've done it and things of that nature? So that's definitely something that if you're thinking about this, I'd encourage you to reach out to Rich or me or someone else at Novogradac and mention the podcast and that you're interested in being introduced to other housing authorities that have done this, just to get a quick check as to, okay, whatever concerns you might have, knowing someone else who's done it and they can share with you what their experience has been might be very helpful. Okay, Rich, thank you very much. We've already created some subject matter for a future podcast, and I do look forward to having you back, but stay around. But before you go, I do want you to share other resources that you would recommend for our audience. And by the way, I will include Rich's contact information in today's show notes. I may have said that already, but if not, I'm saying it again.
So first of all, we have our Affordable Housing Conference next week in Florida. I encourage anybody who can attend to go to that. We will also have a pre-conference workshop on the Wednesday before the conference, which covers the basics of the tax credit program Mike and I talked about today. It is a great beginner's class. You just want to learn the nuts and bolts of the tax credit program. Also, I want to suggest at Novogradac, we have a low-income housing tax credit working group. It's a great group of professionals that get together and talk about the tax credit industry, and I encourage you to be a part of that. Just a great way to be part of the conversation, to be up on things as they're happening.
So thank you, Rich, and thanks for mentioning the conference. I will be at the conference, so if you're listening and or watching, please come up and say hello to me in Florida. And Rich is probably going to be there, but depends on what client meetings he has.
I am trying to make it. I think I can pull that off.
And as Rich mentioned, please give consideration to joining the Novogradac Local Tax Credit Working Group. We have monthly calls and discuss issues that are pressing in the local tax credit space, as well as common regulations and the like. It's a great group to be involved in. And at some point, Rich, we're going to have to form a public housing working group here at Novogradac. We have one for new markets. We have one for rental housing preservation. We have one for renewable energy, have one for opportunity zones, have one for the neighborhood homes tax credit. The public housing working group is one we'll have to stand up. First, we have to get critical mass. So anyone in our audience, if you're interested in such a working group, please email cpas@novoco.com and we'll see if we can't get something stood up on that front.
I like that, Mike. Great
Yes. So please do stay around, Rich, for our off mic section. First, I want to mention to our audience that if you're enjoying the podcast, please, I ask you again, please take a moment to click on the like. On whatever podcast platform you're following us on, please click like. It helps others find the podcast. It helps reinforce the value of me providing the Tax Credit Tuesday to our audience free of charge. Also, if you're so inclined, share a quick review. If you just say something gracious about the podcast on the review, it can just be a few words. Please take a moment. I would very much appreciate it. And then also, please subscribe to the podcast as well as share it with your colleagues. We create this as a free resource to the community development communities in which we serve, and we want to get it as broadly distributed as possible. So please do us a favor of sharing it with others. Now let's turn to the off mic section. This is a fun part. Well, the whole podcast is fun, but this is a particularly fun part because it gives us a chance to recognize others. And there's never enough recognition for all the great work that happens in the way in which so many serve so many in the spaces where we work. So please, Rich, if you could give a shout out to a professional or group of professionals worthy of recognition.
I'd be happy to, Mike. I think my shout out this time goes to the officials at the New Jersey chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, New Jersey NARO. And in particular, the recent conference chairperson, Janice DeJohn of the Passaic County Housing Agency, who's actually a client of ours. I just attended their November 2025 conference, and I was lucky enough to be a guest speaker. So this was like one of the first conferences, housing conference, after the government shutdown. So there was just a ton of interest. They did a great job. They had several hundred participants. They had a lot of HUD new appointees that gave their perspective on the administration, where the industry is going. They had the regional administrator there. It really was a well-run conference. We got some great information. Housing authorities in New Jersey were really pumped about it. And I really look forward to being part of their April 2026 conference. It couldn't have been any more timely and any more informative. So my hats off, my shout out is to Janice DeJohn, the Passaic County Housing Agency, New Jersey NARO.
Thank you for that. I echo your shout out to the New Jersey NARO officials and to Janice. Thank you for having Rich there as a speaker. I'm glad he'll be there again in April. And hopefully the April one won't be after a government shutdown. Hopefully they'll have a shutdown at the end of January. I don't even want to put that out there, but obviously we don't know until we know. And right now we don't know. Thank you for being on the podcast today, Rich. Look forward to having you back to make it a dozen. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for joining us for our 900th podcast. And I look forward to having a podcast every week over the coming few years and getting to 1,000. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.